some sense, and how that kind of progresses through history, what the end goal is, and that's tied for you into your own kind of, I guess, political ambitions, projects, for the world, and you've recently got on YouTube and a few other platforms trying to promote this message. Am I understanding correctly what you're all about?
We're trying to create a new world spirit, yeah, and I haven't made my big debut yet. We were supposed to do this big week of outreach, and I had to postpone it because of this sort of activism I've been doing. So, but you did a nice job. Thank you.
Okay. So my first question is kind of why Hegel? I have read his Logic and a couple other books, but I was also interested in like Schopenhauer, Plato, Kant, um, some other characters, Leibniz. So what was it about Hegel in particular that really connected for you and motivated this whole kind of project for transforming the world that you are on?
So I've answered this question a couple of times, and my videos are all going to sound the same, but it is the same. It's that it's the most once you understand what Hegel is really saying, and not even just Hegel, the essence of what genuine philosophy is supposed to be about. It's the most incredible thing, at least for me, I have ever not only read or studied, but experienced. And the experiential component of it, it's really hard to reach. Once you reach it, though, there's an experience that you get just reading words on a page that I never thought was possible. And you know, I was kind of a bit more like you in the way I had my approach. I approached philosophy from this kind of more perennialist, like all over the place, picking the truth out of each thing. And I did that for probably 18 years, I think. So I started really young. At 13 years of age, I decided I was a philosopher. And a spiritual philosopher, though, where real philosophy was not you know, it wasn't doing it for me. There's something missing in philosophy. But there's also something missing in like spirituality, religion, and New Age philosophy, spirituality. So I was trying to bring them together through quantum mechanics, and I saw you have a video on that on your channel. But then I discovered Hegel relatively late in the game, and it was all that sort of background information that gave me the emotional fortitude to withstand the assault on the ego that happens when you try and read Hegel. So you've tried to read him directly, right?
Yeah.
And if you had to describe your experience, how would you describe it?
I sympathize with a lot of his ideas. I didn't necessarily appreciate his method. Like I don't know that Hegel ever really lays out like a systematic epistemology or grounds a lot of his claims, but certainly his ideas resonated with me.
Really? Okay. I was really hesitant at first to like claim, being like mentored or to have some kind of. I followed one philosopher because I was more like truth is everywhere. You got to pick it and think for yourself and all this stuff. Critical thinking is the tool of philosophy, or at least of science, scientific philosophy. And I'm confident now that I can say that's changed. I confidently follow Hegel, and and it's because he points beyond himself. And he says, actually, you're going to sublate me. A lot of people say, well, he's the end of history, he's the end of all these things. In a certain way, he is, but in a certain way, he's not. He actually says, you have to transcend me as well. And I thought, whoa, this is not the Hegel that people told me about. He's actually being humble while also being confident. And when I started really giving him a chance, actually, he crossed my path twice before, and I know I've said this in other interviews, but those first two times I was learning him through someone else. You only get what I'm about to talk to you about if we get to it in this interview or in this debate or whatever this turns out to be by reading him directly. And if you're already resonating with him, you're already ahead of the game, right? Because the more universal experience is that it's just meaningless verbiage, this gibberish that doesn't make any sense. Like most people can't even understand a single paragraph or a sentence, and that was me. So I'm kind of curious, when you were reading him, what parts made sense to you that you identified with? I'm not sure if you have your own videos on this, but I'm just kind of curious. Maybe we can pick up where you actually resonated, and then maybe we can get to a sublation. And if people don't know what that is, we can get into that too. Maybe that's what made sense to you was sublation.
Okay. So I liked the idea of like I kind of mentioned in the intro, historical dialectic, the kind of interaction of the ideal realm with the material realm. Um, Obviously thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Hmm.
It makes sense at a certain level in explanatory terms, historically, also metaphysically. It does seem to me like something like that is going on. I've been more interested in Plato in recent years, and this one Hegelian concept, is not so apparent in Plato, which is kind of the kind of eschatological culmination of history in the absolute idea manifesting, and that's not something I got from other philosophers,
Yeah.
but it is something that I had heard about in spiritual circles that I was interested in. So just kind of, yeah, the general metaphysical scheme, the Platonism in Hegel, I recognized and appreciated, and also that there would be, some progress towards a culmination point. And um, yeah, I guess I've been interested in eschatological views mythologically as well, as big into like Joseph Campbell. And like I said, that's something that's kind of lacking in Plato. He has a very cyclical model of things, right? Like our fate is determined by the precession of the circle of the same and the other, that is the fixed stars and then moving planets. And so he's in a certain way like fatalistic, and our salvation is kind of out of this world, is transcending
Hmm.
the corporeal sphere and returning ourselves to the realm of idea rather than like manifesting the absolute idea here. Um, but I'm also a Christian, so I like the idea of like logos incarnate, and you do get that. I believe Hegel was a Christian still, right? And his system was used theologically within the context of like mythological Christianity. Am I wrong about that? Did Hegel deconvert?
Well, it's the way you talk about him has to change, right? Like that's the hard thing to communicate, but I'll try here. It's like this kind of, it sounds like sophism at first, and I can completely understand why people say, well, he doesn't ever give a straight answer, but he is. But you have to think in what Christianity calls the living spirit. And in order to be a true Christian, like what I think a concrete Christian is supposed to be, you have to think in the living way of logic. Whereas even when you're a Christian, you understand the life, and the life is important, the life, the truth, and the way, right? The way is what's missing. And you get it in parable, but the parable doesn't make the logic, the Platonic stuff that you're talking about, make sense. You don't get the essence of that. And you still end up being a Christian in an abstract logic, which makes it dead, which is exactly what Jesus was trying to get over with the Old Testament. He says, I'm bringing a new spirit, like it's a living spirit, not just the law. There's something about the law that he says is true, but there's something more. And that's the thing that Hegel's giving us. And when you get that, how you answer this question, is he a Christian, is the way I answer it now, which is you don't want to be pigeonholed into the abstract Christian mode because it's not truly Christian. If Jesus came today, he wouldn't be an abstract Christian. You know what I'm saying? He would be more. He knows how to love his enemies and not just tolerate them. An abstract Christian can only tolerate their enemies at best. And then a concrete Christian is a genuine philosopher. So I would say that Hegel is and is not a Christian. He's not a dead Christian. He's a truly living Christian. But a truly living Christian is not a religious Christian. Religious Christianity is what he is in the religious mode of consciousness. But the religious mode of consciousness is not the end of the system. The mode that is opposite to Christianity is, of course, abstract atheism. But the truth of both those modes is actually not just abstract philosophy, because some guys have gotten that far. They've gotten to the point where, okay, the thing that transcends religious consciousness is science, But modern science is not real science either. Modern science has the same problem as abstract Christianity, which is why they condition each other. They're on the same level in a certain way, but they're in the right direction. It is transcending, but it's in the more or less atheistic mode only. Or not even the true atheist is actually the absolute atheist. But the absolute atheist and the concrete Christian and the concrete Muslim and the concrete anything, any concrete ideology is always genuine philosophy, which is the infinite in the scientific form. And so Hegel says that at the absolute limit of religious consciousness, Christianity is the closest, at least in his time, but it's stuck in sensuousness. So you have to transcend that with a certain kind of atheism, but it's the perfect atheistic beginning that the concrete whole, the absolute, uses to arrive and prove itself scientifically in the ultimate form of thought. But it arrives back at that concrete totality, which is what we call God. But in terms of an atheist, it's kind of like the atheistic God, which is an oxymoron, right? But that's the point. Speculative thinking holds opposites in immediate unities. And so I would say that Hegel is a Christian in terms of religious consciousness, but in terms of a genuine philosopher, he's all of them. He's Platonist, he's Aristotelian, he's pre-Socratic, he's Neoplatonist, I would say even Muslim, if he kind of bashes them a little bit, but he actually also gives them quite a bit of credit in other places. It is this interesting language between foundationalism and fulfillment. And so Christianity got very close to that, but they couldn't make the leap. So that's how he's able to answer. What's that, sorry?
What do you mean by foundationalism there?
It means that the prior stages to truth are also necessary. That means they have to be there. That means that they're not necessarily lesser. They're lesser in one aspect, but they're essential in another aspect. So it doesn't make sense to talk about prior stages as less significant or important or worthy of attention than further ones, because it's a circle. So just because your religion comes sooner in history, which means it comes sooner in the divine idea, doesn't mean it's not worthy of consideration. So that means you have to consider them. And then the people that come as a foundation might say, well, we came before you, we're more fundamental, we're more important, you have to go back to your roots, the beginning was pure. And then they say, all that other stuff is like history confusing itself. But the reality is that they're both essential moments, the ones that come after and the ones that come before, because you have to start thinking in that living way, in that cyclical, in the true cycle of thinking, of pure thought, speculative thought. And it's kind of a little bit mystical, so you're kind of easy to talk to off the bat because you sort of believe in that world, right? You believe that this other world, the transcendental world, actually exists for real. It has an epistemological and an ontological existence, right?
Yes, I believe the realm of forms it has a greater reality than this world. This world is emergent out of that realm of forms. So yeah, I don't think you can have coherent philosophy unless you make some kind of assumption like that. I mean, the only alternative historically to that has been nominalism. So you have to say that language carries meaning simply because we arbitrarily designate labels on things. There aren't, real types in nature. There are real types in nature. Where do those subsist? You need the realm of forms at some level. But yeah, so basically what I liked about Hegel was you have this descent of forms here to structure things here. It's not that that's not present in Plato at all. He is in many ways a political thinker, and he wants to transform society to better reflect the nature of the metaphysical realm. So like our architecture, our art, our cultural practices should all like be embodiments of form. And that's a great idea. But I think Plato.
You can take it if you want. We can pause it.
Yeah, I probably will pause it and I'll. What's on call right now? What's going on? Yeah, it's okay. So this will have been edited out. What was the last thing that happened right before the break?
You were talking about nominalism a little bit, and
Right.
you're saying you believe in this other world more transcendentally.
Mm-hmm. So Plato does emphasize the need for the forms to be present. He wants to embody that politically in like civic engineering, in very mundane political senses, but he does want to emphasize the kind of cyclic nature of this process, as you state. I mean, it's revealed in the Timaeus in the beginning that the model of the perfect city from the Republic is actually the same as the constitution of the ancient Athens from 10,000 years ago, when it was first founded by Athena. Um, but there is that idea of a coincidence of the origin and the end, and that becomes especially apparent in Neoplatonism, that the source of things is also their proper good. So pure progression, it means a deviation away from goodness in a certain respect. You know, the peak of things, what Hegel calls the absolute, is the Platonic good. Then progress away from that, creation away from that into diversity, into the infinite, the indefinite in the Platonic scheme. That is going to be descent into evil, sort of, to some extent, but it ultimately results in a greater good because that progression, followed by a reversion, amounts to a fuller being of the higher realm than it otherwise would be. Like it's better for the one to be prolific rather than unprolific. So creation and all of that is worth it. But yeah, I think the emphasis is on returning to an ideal state that kind of already existed in some sense. Whereas with Hegel, I think there's more of an emphasis on the progress, on the infinite, and there is this like eschatological vision that's not as obvious in Plato. So that's one thing that I wasn't so attracted to in Hegel, that he seems to like uphold the idea of the infinite as a positive, and that's typical of like Faustian civilization. I think that's not the most kind of healthy symbolism. So what do you think about that, Hegel's attitudes towards the infinite, and how that might contrast with Platonic attitudes about the infinite or the indefinite?
So when you're saying the infinite here, you mean the other world, like the world of contingency, and like you can deviate from the idea. Is that what you mean by the infinite, or do you mean the infinite as the absolute? You have to be really careful in your language.
That conflation is what I'm concerned about in Hegel. Is, yeah, I think the infinite follows from the order of the indefinite dyad, right? You have the one and then the monad, peros, order, and the indefinite dyad, apeiron, chaos, and everything that flows from that. So the infinite is the principle of expansion, and therefore moving away from the good. It's the kind of lesser of the two fundamental principles of things.
Okay, I feel like I'm picking up where you are a little bit more. Hegel does not confuse anything, in my opinion, at least to the level of all the other philosophers. Like it's hard to describe. Like it is the most incredible thing I have ever read and experienced because he's so precise with his words. So in the way you're talking about it, like let's really simplify it for people who want to really understand. This is not like a debatey kind of like I wasn't sure if it was going to be like a rapid fire, but this one might actually have some learning in it. So let's simplify it a bit and say there's just these two worlds. There's the sort of transcendental God world where everything is perfect. People usually call this heaven, right? Perfect reason, Plato's realm of forms, you could say, but in the Hegelian sense, which is a lot more concrete than the way Plato left it. And then you get this other world. So this world's infinite, the super-sensuous world. And then world number two is the realm of like creation, like in Christian, in the Bible and in liturgies and stuff like that. It says, okay, this world, the first world, creates the second world. One comes before the other. This is the created world where evil and all this terrible stuff can happen, and chaos and this stuff. This world is also infinite. And I was listening to one person I'm really hoping to talk to once I get back in my outreach mode is somebody named Jay Dyer. I don't know if you know who that is.
I've had a debate with them.
Oh, have you? Okay. Okay. Jay, people are starting to listen to the message. Like the real Hegel, the real genuine philosophy starts to resonate pretty quickly. So my goal is just to kind of send out some feelers to the real geniuses. Somebody put me in touch with you, I guess, because I think you're one of them. From what I see, you have the right sort of openness of mind, but the right rigor to get to the speculative truth, which is really hard to do. You have the ability to break out of abstract thinking. And Jay, listening to him, I watched one video. Somebody sent it to me and said, you got to listen to this guy to prepare for this other Orthodox Christianity debate. Because I wasn't raised Orthodox Christian. Like, I'm learning all the particular languages, but the universality of them is so powerful. It literally is the living spirit. I'm convinced. Like, Hegel convinced me, and he was the only one. That's how powerful this is. So to answer your question kind of simply, these two worlds are infinite. Jay says that this one, the created one, ex nihilo, it was created ex nihilo, which means it can't be infinite. It doesn't have any eternal traits. This one is the only eternal one. But that can't be true. There's an internal contradiction there to Christianity itself. Because Hegel says spirit is eternal. It is infinite. Because it's a return to God, right? So if spirit is only possible in the created world as a return to the first perfect world, if it is eternal, that means the medium in which it passes through also has to be eternal. And that's why it's a circle. The whole thing is eternal. But this is the thing that Jay wants to preserve, which it is preserved in Hegel. The order still is maintained. And that sounds like a logical contradiction. How can you have a world of time and a world of timelessness and have an order? Well, it's because the ordering is that universal kind of logic. It's conceptual time in a sensuous time as a moment of the timeless time. And it makes a lot of sense the way that Hegel does it systematically. But I think once Jay or any Christian that's an apologetist that really wants to understand the theological, the systematic, scientific version of it, will come to a huge realization, incredible realization like I've been coming to, which is that both these worlds are infinite. Same with the third world. The world of spirit is infinite. It's the way you think about them that makes the infinities true or false. So I think that you're right in terms of the Platonic understanding that in this world you can have an infinite digression, an infinite divergence from the pureness of reason coming through this realm. That's contingency. The being of this might get a little heady. Once it starts to click, you start thinking on a different level. So for me, what I'm saying to you is actually simpler than what you said before, but I understand that it sounds disjointed. So if you want to stop me at any point, you can. But I'll just say, just to wrap this up kind of quickly, is that you're right to say that there can be an infinite divergence in this created world, which leads to evil and all this one-sidedness. But there's also this infinity coming through it, so you can return to it. And without those two moments in this one, it can't be external and can't realize itself to return as spirit. So you need them all. But the way you think determines which infinite you go down. And if you go down the positive infinite that aligns with the fulfillment of the idea in this realm, the created realm, that's what spirit is. It is thinking. It is mind. But we don't like to use the word mind because mind has the connotation of particularity with it, which makes it sinful. That's what Christianity is talking about in the traditional literature. But it doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater and you stop thinking, you just return to faith only. Faith is absolutely the bedrock of truth. You need to start with that. And that's what atheists and a lot of the other abstract ideologies don't want to admit. But you have to start there, but you can't stop there because you'll never reach spirit. Your soul doesn't develop into spirit if you stay at faith, because that's the mode of immediacy only. You have to mediate the immediacy, and that's when you start achieving higher levels of absolute spirit. That's a lot, maybe. Does that make sense to you in terms of the Platonic stuff, or did I go too far?
Well, it's similar to Hegel himself. I resonate and sympathize with a lot of the ideas that you're expressing, but yeah, it does seem very disjointed and not.
Really?
I don't understand why you believe what you're saying. You were saying a lot of things. That's kind of the impression I get from you.
Wow, really?
Since I understand what he's aiming at, because he was inspired by Plato, I'm also inspired by Plato. It makes sense. I don't agree with the claim that Plato left things indefinite and unfinished and ambiguous, and Hegel systematized it. I think it's the opposite. Plato left a very concrete system. I mean, if you look at Proclus
So my goal, I guess, in this conversation, because you're ahead of the game here, is you're right. Plato is a foundational moment, like we said before. He's a foundational moment of which Hegel fully embraces and only negates the limits of his thought. And it's like, well, Plato doesn't have very many limits. Well, Aristotle came right after and said, actually, you do. So, like, the very next guy in history actually negated Plato. But the mistake of traditional historians is that Aristotle's not an abstract negation of Plato. He's not the antithesis. So most people in history, like if I was to ask you how would you describe the relationship between Plato and Aristotle, how would you describe it in your learning so far?
Well, what I really believe is that Aristotle essentially agreed with Platonic metaphysics up to the point what Neoplatonists would call the second hypostasis intellect is what Aristotle places as, the Hegelian absolute. And that's Aristotle's mistake. And so I do think that was a genuine mistake in understanding. But then after he separated from the academy, when he founded Lyceia, when he was rejected as the successor to Plato, he went back and edited some of his earlier texts to make it appear as though he was more, anti-Platonist than he in fact was.
Oh. So I'm getting into the particularities. I'm rereading Plato. I have to reread everybody. Like it's just like I actually have a document where I'm doing this called the synchronicity document where I have 117 philosophers that I've kind of covered in the past. Some new ones actually I don't know about, like the Mandaeans and stuff like that. That Gnostic tribe I didn't know about. So some of them are new, but I have to even revisit the old ones I did study because it's such a radical, like everything is familiar. Like Hegel is using all the familiar words, right? The most familiar. But it's a whole new world. It is, I understand, not just intellectually, but emotionally, what those great things, what Jesus was saying, for instance. Not just what he was saying in parable, but like what the essence of what I guess I would call the super sensuous message was. If you had to get rid of the sensuousness of Jesus' message, what are you left with? You're left with his super sensuous logic. The Father is what he calls it. But also Buddha makes a lot more sense to me. Almost any mystic. And it's because when you return to these foundational, the real contributions to wisdom in history, whether it's religious, artistic, genuine, abstract philosophy, whatever it is, whatever mode it's in, you can't get rid of it. It's like a growing organism. It's like trying to get rid of the seeds of a plant to get to the blossom. It's like you can't do that. And that's how people talk in philosophy right now, which is why it doesn't make any sense. That's why we have all these oppositions. And if we do make progress, even the progress is disjointed. And so Hegel stitches them all together. Plato was one, but I'm still refamiliarizing myself. I'm getting the rust off of my old readings. But I would say, like, actually, I could talk at length because it's just so profound. But maybe before I do that, I'll get a little more clarity from you on this distinction of the intellect that you think Aristotle incorrectly placed above Plato, or what Aristotle placed above Plato. What is wrong with him putting the intellect as a higher place than where you think Plato was?
It's not so much that he elevated intellect above where it had been placed in Platonism, it's that he chopped the top off of the pyramid. You have to have the idea of this fundamentally simple, right? The intellect has energies, it has relations, and maybe intellect, qua intellect, involves the combination of form and matter, not like base matter, but prime matter. The monad and indefinite dyad, monad is the principle of form, the indefinite dyad is the principle of matter. Iamblichus calls it prime matter. So the forms already have this combination of the limit and the unlimited in particular ways. And there's a dynamics for how that operates and how the forms are distinguished from one another. They contain each other, but in specific proportions.
Mm-hmm.
So
So that's not the top. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
That's not in Platonism, because that already involves these intellectual energies, which are specific combinations of form and matter. It doesn't make sense as intellect unless those differentiations are there. And there has to be something prior to that, because that's a multiplicity, and unity is inherently prior to multiplicity. It has to be. So you have to have the one as the first thing, which is not the same as like the number one. It's the principle of unity and goodness. And goodness and unity are seen to be the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Proclus also has a principle.
Or true unity, anyway. But sorry, go ahead.
Proclus has a principle that the higher elements of the ontological hierarchy energize further.
Mm-hmm.
Let's. Okay, I'm gonna edit this out.
Sure. He was a busy man. That's what happens when you're close to the truth. If your heart is pure, good things happen to you, hopefully. I mean, we are in the realm of the created, so what can I say so far while he's not here? Let me get in. I think this can be a very beautiful conversation because he has the tool set already, like the fact that he knows Aristotle and Plato, even in an abstract form. Gives a really strong foundation to understand the words. And that's why Christianity, if you're a Christian watching this, that's why the Bible emphasizes the word a lot, and why you can't avoid it. But word usually means sensuousness, but you can use it in a super sensuous way, which maybe we'll get to. What's that, sorry? I was talking to the audience, just in case you don't cut this out, but you can.
I definitely will.
Okay.
Depending on what you said, maybe that's some gold.
I didn't get any more significant, but yeah. Okay, continue. Go ahead.
So yeah, the point was just that higher elements of the ontological hierarchy have their effects transmitted further down than intermediate effects, and you can see this in discrete attributes in the anosphere. Like more things experience general goods than experience intellectual goods. Right? The good proceeds farther than the intellectual. Let's see. I'm trying to think of some other good examples of like how that principle operates, but so I can just leave it at that and say that there's a reason for positing something super intellectual, also super essential, right? Like being, the Greek ousia, is identified as the peak of the realm of intellect. So it's with intellect that being proper begins, but beings, ousias, have like definite essences. And in order to have that notion of definition applied, it has to be applied from something, from principles which are themselves super essential. So if you conflate these levels together, you don't notice the distinction of how their energies are distributed in things. And also, you get like confusion of metaphysical concepts like being, essence, existence. And that's what I'm afraid happens with Hegel, just based on the way he uses the term infinite in a few different senses, and it's not clear exactly what he means by it. And I don't know exactly what he places as the first principle, but it seems like he leans more towards the side of Aristotle, and I don't think that ultimately works metaphysically.
Okay, your perception makes more sense to me now. So if I tried to clarify and say, if the sentence that really stands out to me that could be sublated here is that you say Aristotle chopped the top of the pyramid off, and the pyramid is the realm of forms, right? The pure realm of forms without intellect. In itself, purely Plato, not tainting it with human particularity. Or are you saying that he is preserving that realm? What's the top of the pyramid exactly? The essentialist order?
The realm of forms is the second hypostasis. You have the first hypostasis, which is the one, the monad, the indefinite dyad, and the headads, which are aspects of unity. They're themselves super-essential. And then you have intellect, beginning with being, ending with the cosmic demiurge. And then you have the realm of souls beneath that. So Aristotle preserves the realm of forms, but he simplifies it and kind of crushes it all into
Okay, so you're saying that it's just not a distinct top of the pyramid.
No,
Like,
he does chop off that super essential realm. There's nothing super essential
isn't that
and
isn't
super
that
intellectual for Aristotle.
okay?
He ends at the realm of forms proper, whereas Plato actually goes beyond the realm of forms.
Oh, what does he call beyond the realm of forms?
The one.
Does
Or when he
he?
talks about the monad and the indefinite dyad, I subscribe to the view that Plato was a Pythagorean, and these are Pythagorean concepts: the one, the monad, and the indefinite dyad. Neo-Pythagoreans talk about it, and they have this same kind of metaphysical scheme. They usually use the tetractys to illustrate it, the dot pyramid, like 1 dot, 2 dot, 3 dots. Um,
So then, what does Pythagoras say about the one or the beginning, the true beginning, the beyond the realm of forms?
yeah, that, like in most metaphysical systems, mythologically speaking, it's undifferentiated, ineffable, right? We can only characterize it analogically and like by negation via negativa, or what's it called? Um, Not cataphatic predication is where you say something positive.
Apophatic.
The opposite of cataphatic is apophatic. Yeah, thank
Apophatic.
you. So apophatic predication. So yeah, it's a very mystical notion, and that's like the definition of mysticism, basically. That you believe the foundation of things cannot be expressed, and that makes sense because expression implies some ordering syntax that renders the expression intelligible, and so you're already presupposing higher ordering principles when you express a sentence. So no direct expression like that can characterize absolute first principles, because to talk about it, you're invoking like supposedly yet higher principles, but you can't do that. You can't put God in a category, because then the idea of category is, de facto higher than God, and that's impossible.
Okay, so now I'm getting your viewpoint, and you are very close. The fact that you're kind of transcending Plato with Pythagoras is really, I haven't heard anybody say that yet. So maybe this Neo-Pythagorean stuff is, while you're aligning with where Hegel really starts. So you have, I think, a foundation of knowledge where what I'm about to say will make sense because you see the need for the movements, why they're essential, but they can still be handled in the intellect, but not the ordinary intellect. You have to think in what Christianity would call spirit. If you have true spiritual thinking, you have divine knowledge and divine categories. Where I would start with this is saying Hegel does start with an apophatic beginning because that's the only way you can get to the Lord version of godness. It is the God that is no God, that you make no assumptions about it, that you don't say anything about it. Because as soon as you do from a finite state, you change it. So it's basically what the Tao was trying to get at. It's this ineffability where you can't say anything about it. All you can do is negate to arrive at it. And that's exactly what Hegel does. And it's where I started to change my perspective on how deep he really was. That the reason why he loved Aristotle so much is because Aristotle did not chop the top of the pyramid off. He just didn't fill it in exactly the way that you say. So what you're right about is that he did the top of the pyramid incompletely, but not in the wrong way. So he had the way right, but he didn't have the system right. He didn't have the intellect mapped out and its super coherence, which is what spirit is in true science. Most people, the mistake that I don't think you're making, because you've affirmed both sides of this opposition that most people don't grasp, is that most people see that not only is the top of the pyramid chopped off, but the realm of forms is chopped off. Aristotle is the true empiricist, and Plato is just this pure idealist, right? And so they war as Aristotle being trapped in the finite intellect, which is the particularity of the universal. But you're saying, you're not making that mistake. You're not saying they're complete opposites in that way. You're saying he does preserve the realm of forms, the realm of the universal. He's just, the super-essentialities thing is what he's messing up and making tainted as human categories. And of course, you can't grasp the Tao, you can't grasp the Lord version of God, the infinite kind, with the human finite intellect. So I think with that established, how does Hegel think of Aristotle in the truer sense is that Aristotle does preserve the realm of forms, like you said, and he does start particularizing it, but he does it in fragments of divine knowledge. And because the fragments are themselves not connected to the whole, to the Tao, to the Lord version of God, they themselves cannot be divine knowledge completely. But the way he built the fragments in a speculative way of thinking is the way spirit thinks. It's just that he didn't put it in the total system that self-justifies itself beyond human intellect. So spirit is what knows itself as spirit. So in a way, the only way to verify spirit's truth from the empirical realm is to do what you said earlier. You have unparticipated forms, forms purely in themselves, and then participated forms. Think of this realm, the first realm, the super-essentialist realm, the realm of forms technically, as participating in itself. The forms participate in themselves perfectly. In this realm, though, it's doing it through our finite intellect as a fractal replication of what God is doing as participating in itself. It is its own concept and the instantiation of that concept, which means that it is simultaneously ontological and epistemological at the exact same time. It thinks its own being perfectly. We can't do that, but we are doing a finite version of it that's approximating it closer and closer and closer when you have the right super-essentialities building on top of each other. And that building from like the top down is exactly what I think you're right about. And Pythagoras, Hegel says, does come as a foundational moment before Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. He's pre-Socratic as necessary. But what he missed was that he put everything into numbers, right? And he says, okay, the one you can't say anything about, he got that moment right, but he got that moment from Parmenides, right? But Parmenides kind of got it from, I don't know how to say his name, Thales or Thales, right? Thales.
And Parmenides was after Pythagoras.
Was he? Because in my reading, Thales comes first, and he says...
Eleatic school was influenced by Pythagoreanism.
Oh, that's right. I haven't read his history of philosophy in a while. The reason why Pythagoras comes first is because he didn't have the system yet, and he didn't have any pure thought. He just had a number form. So that makes more sense now. Yeah, you corrected me. Parmenides builds on Pythagoras because he has the first pure thought in the right order, whereas Pythagoras had the right kind of systematic thinking, but in the wrong, not the wrong form, but a form that is still too much in the intellect, because he has it in numbers. Quantity comes after pure being. But pure being is that moment of truth that you're talking about, that Pythagoras was narrowing in on with the one, but he didn't have it in the systematic oneness of it. He says, yeah, it comes first. But I think that what you have to do is you have to do it in the way that Parmenides did it, which is saying that you can't say anything about it numerically even. You can't call it a one. That's what Pythagoras was adding from his intellect that is not appropriate in that lordship moment of the Tao, because you are saying something about it that doesn't apply to that kind of infinity. That first infinity that Parmenides grasped clearly in its essentiality, that Pythagoras didn't, which is why he came first. Now that makes a lot more sense. Is because Pythagoras was adding stuff to it. He didn't grasp it clearly as a true super-essentiality. It's not really super-essential though, it's the first essential. So the only way to get to it though is apophatically, which is what Parmenides kind of did right. But Hegel says he didn't do it in the speculative way. That's why true philosophy, genuine philosophy starts with him, but he doesn't get past it because he doesn't grasp true speculative thought. So I don't know how much of this is making sense to you, especially since I had to correct myself historically. The order of it makes sense to me universally, but the history stuff is contingent. It's not as essential as this thing I'm trying to tell you about, which you're calling these super-essentialities, which is beyond. It's the top of the pyramid, but the top of the pyramid can be known if you take all the fragments of what Aristotle was doing, not as the abstract negation of Plato, but as the fulfillment of Plato. Now, I don't know how much, if you had to go from 0 to 100%, how much of what I'm saying so far makes sense to you? Like 50-50 is like half makes sense, half doesn't make sense. Where are you at on that in terms of the language I'm using?
I think I understand what you're saying, but I disagree. I don't think that characterizing the top of the pyramid as in essence is appropriate, because again, the basic problem is you're categorizing it. I think we have to be beyond all category, and so it cannot be a particular essence. Then the notion of essence has to be beyond the first being.
So you're right there. What we're talking about when we're talking about Parmenides' version of pure being is it's not a particular. It is a universal. How would I describe this? So as you know, in Hegelian philosophy, that first category, a category that's no category, is sheer immediate indeterminacy. So it can't be a category because it's indeterminate. The only category it could be is indeterminacy, but a category that's pure indeterminate is no category. You can't say anything about it because it's not compared to any other categories. So in that way, you're right. But that's not what I said. I'm not saying that that's necessarily a particular. What makes it a particular, because it's at the top of this pyramid, right? It's the thing that grounds all the other essentialities. But it's an essence that is not yet a formal essence because it has to define itself into its own definition. Like that's why the second moment of the logic, the second moment, not the first, the second moment is essence formally, where you can describe it as essence. But in this first moment, we're in the realm of being, which is pure immediacy. This first category is sheer immediate indeterminacy, which is not even being. This is pure being.
Well, this is reinforcing the problem that I had that I mentioned up front. The first thing I asked you about Hegel seeming to conflate the infinite and indefinite with the absolute. And I think that's not the case. The first principle can't be indeterminacy or indefiniteness. It's undifferentiated, not like as opposed to being a source of limit. It is both and a source of limit and contains the unlimited energies that it proceeds outward, but you can't characterize any of that cataphatically. All of that is going to have to be kind of analogically circulating around the concept.
Yeah.
And I do think the Pythagorean scheme of having the one that is just pure simplicity, no further category than that applied to it is appropriate, and then the first two super essential attributes that come out of it would be limit and the unlimited. And by placing the unlimited into the one itself, I think you're confusing this fundamental foundation of the Pythagorean Platonic system of metaphysics, which
Yeah.
informed all of Western philosophy. It's a big confusion to run into. I think it needs to be avoided.
Well, you're right, because you're right. That is confusion that's happening, but I'm not making that here because you haven't given me a chance to mention what limit is. But in this first stage, pure indeterminateness means no limit. That's why it's indeterminate. So you're absolutely right. But where that limit comes into play is not where I think Pythagoras puts it in. I think Hegel puts it in the right place because limit develops itself, or limit is developed out of this indeterminacy, not in the stage of pure becoming or even determinate being or even something in other. It comes after something in other, midway between finitude. So even this first stage, this pure being, is not even finitude yet. Finitude has to develop out of this stage because there's no limit. And you're like, well, how do you get a second category? This is the problem that Hegel talks about. He says most people can't grasp this beginning because they insert a limit when you can't. So then the contradiction is, well, how do you get two from one if there's no limit to connect anything? There's no definitions to grapple on. Like you can't manipulate it, you can't come out of it or into it. There's nothing you can do. So how do you build a whole system as the ground? And Hegel says it's because the thing that you connect first to that pure being, that state of immediate indeterminacy, is not itself something. It's not something that brings in a limit. It's a limit that is no limit. And it's like, well, you're just talking out of the side of your mouth. That's a contradiction. But it makes sense as the only way to get around this problem, because the only way to connect to a super-essentiality that has no limit is by connecting it to a nothing. And not a nothing of something, because it's super-essential, right? It is pure nothing of the pure being. That means that pure nothing has no limit either. But it is something different than sheer immediate indeterminacy. You are comparing two things, but they are a thing that's not a thing. Thing comes way after, like the one. The one does establish a limit, but the limit is itself. This doesn't even have a limit of itself. I hope this makes a little bit of sense, but when you connect a pure nothing to an indeterminacy,
I don't think it makes sense.
it is the same. Well, just let me say this last part then, I guess. It is two things that are distinguished, but are actually exactly the same, because there's no predicate, there's no externality differentiating them. It's an internal differentiation. That's how Hegel gets over it. It makes sense, because that means you preserve that first category as an absolute, because it's not pulling in anything outside of itself, because we arrived at it through an absolute negation of all things, including negation of its own self. That means you take a negative, and the opposite, when you try and cancel that negative, you don't end up more negative, because that's still affirming the negative. It has to turn into its opposite, which is why the first indeterminacy is less than nothing, but still affirmative. But then when you connect the pure nothing to it, as a limitless, it's a distinction that is no distinction. That's the true speculative beginning, because it's doing two opposites at the exact same time. And out of that, you get a pure becoming, which is in two moments, and then from that you rebuild the one. And one is a true moment that Pythagoras has correctly. But it doesn't come in this beginning, because a one has a limit. It has a being for self. But this is so indeterminate, so perfectly ineffable, that it can only move itself as a whole. Every move in that super-essentiality is the whole of everything. That's holy thinking. That's why that's the way that spirit has to think. Every thought has to be the true universal. It can't be particularized, except a particular universal. When I grasp that, I don't know how much of this is making sense to you. When I grasp that, I can't see any other way to begin less essentially. Like, even pulling in the one is too much. If you do anything other than what Hegel has done, you are doing more than sheer immediate indeterminacy. Like, I can't think my way. I'm sure in the future we might, but for now, it's so far beyond what anybody else has done. Like, he went miles further than Descartes, right? Descartes started the absolute negation, but he included the I. But you have to negate the I, because the sheer immediacy doesn't have any external thinker. We're not taking an external Aristotelian empirical look at it. He says, if you do this absolute negation, this apophatic moment properly, you get rid of the self, kind of like Buddhism says. You get rid of your original sin in Christianity, is what you would call it. You cancel even your own finite knowledge from the tree of knowledge. You cancel that knowledge. But by canceling that knowledge, paradoxically, you get in touch with the first divine thought. But the first divine thought is not anything you can say anything about, except that it moves its whole self. And that first move is into pure nothing. But then from that pure nothing, you get pure becoming, and then all these limits that are no limits start to develop into limits. And you get this tree of essentialities that is super consistent, super coherent, but only as a universal structure of particularities. You don't get the Aristotelian particulars of the sensuous mixing of those two realms. That's the mistake that you are 100% correct on. But you said in the beginning of this interview that Hegel, you don't like Hegel because he doesn't ground his system on anything, but he does. He grounds it on that truth, what Christianity calls the Lord, the thing that is always ineffable. But it doesn't mean you can't say anything about it. You get the categories off of that when you think the categories in themselves, but you have to do it in the right way, the way, the truth, and the life, the living way. So I'm saying that nobody else has ever tried to do that. Aristotle kind of did it, but he left it in its particular form, which is why people don't grasp why he's the sublation of Plato and not the abstract negation, why he's a progress of spirit and genuine philosophy and not this stagnated moment where he's pretending not to be Platonic, even though he kind of was. but he's saying I am doing something more. And it was building these systematic universals in their super-essentiality, grounded on the unmoved mover. But that's a speculative thought. What is an unmoved mover? Well, it is absolute spirit, but he's coming from the other end of the total system, where God's returning to itself as already knowing itself. And we're trying to do that. But when you accomplish it here, like Jesus did, right? That's why he's 100% man, 100% God. That's the only way that you can know it for yourself in the divine way, because knowing knows itself through coherence. It can't ever do it through empiricism. You can do correspondence and you can rebuild it, kind of. But when you get the full system, it completes itself as the alpha and the omega, all that kind of circular stuff. But to get the alpha and the omega, you have to start with that first pure super-essentiality, the way you're talking about it, but not the Pythagorean way, because he already introduces too much with the one. But the one is still essential.
Yeah, I don't think you have less than one if you posit the undeterminate as the first thing. Saying it's undeterminate, saying it's undifferentiated itself is a negative predication, but then the one is not meant to be like a numerical description. It's not meant to say this, it fits in this category. The one represents the absence of multiplicity in a certain regard, but to say that it is undifferentiated is a mistake, or undetermined is a mistake, or that it's infinite, I think, is a mistake, because all of those particular predicates as privileged over the limit, I mean, in that little kind of dialectic you just described, the limit appears quite late, and I do think that is self-negating and incoherent, because to have the dialectic, to have successive stages of development prior to limit is a self-contradiction.
You're right.
Because you are defining a succession of
You're absolutely right.
operations, and those obey some kind of logic, they obey some kind of principles, and there you have limit then presupposed.
Yeah, you're kind of right. Okay. So now you're getting to the real deep stuff. So this stuff didn't make sense to me. Now we're going to cross over. This is where the words explicit and implicit become absolutely essential. So when you're in the circle of reason, and when you're grasping it truly universally in divine spirit, all the universals always have to be happening at the same time, at least in the perfect realm. When you connect with spirit, that starts happening in you in the sensuous realm, but you're in the world, but you're not of it, like all that Christian stuff. When God is doing it for itself, how can you have an order that is simultaneously happening at the exact same time always, eternally? Doesn't make any sense, because an order implies before and after, so you have to have some kind of time in a timeless realm even.
I don't think so.
Well, that's because you're probably...
timeless order.
Exactly.
You have an eternal order as well.
So you're ahead of the curve then. You grasp the speculative nature of time. So you understand conceptual time as timeless order. Because before and after place are conflated with the sensuous version of those, right? In sensuous time and space, which is a linear. But that's not what's happening with place and time here. This is pure place and time, which doesn't require that linearity. So I think you'll get this. When you are in this timeless order, if you start anywhere on the circle that grounds itself, the perfect idea grounds itself, because it doesn't need anything outside of itself, except knowledge of itself, which we can get into. But in terms of the perfect logic, it grounds itself. And if you start anywhere on that circle, whether it's that pure being or essence or the notion or the syllogism or whatever, all the categories that come before its own formal explication have to be there because they're eternal, they're universal. But they aren't there explicitly. So this distinction between explicit and implicit becomes absolutely essential to resolve the contradiction you're talking about. And without it, you're right, the system looks completely paradoxical and nonsensical.
I just don't see anything original here either, because I think credit should be given where it's due, and these ideas are present already in the Upanishads. And the one equates to Brahman in tantric thought, the principle of the monad equates to Purusha, the eternal man, and the indefinite dyad, its energies are Prakriti, projected from
Yeah.
And it's already there in Proclus. I mean, one principle is that what is prior causally contains what is subsequent, and so there is no de novo creation or ex nihilo creation. All kind of procession, in a sense, is virtual, because the real substance, I would say essence, but a little bit of a
It's contradictory.
But yeah, what is distributed and differentiated into separate beings is already there in its cause, as you're saying. So, but it's not that limit appears at a particular stage down the chain. I think you have to put limit above the unlimited. You have to put order above chaos, or else the whole metaphysical system breaks down. And the reason this is a useful system, I think, and the reason Pythagoreans developed mathematics and like all of the history of math has been so powerful, is that there's a deep like symbolic analogical truth in that, in that like measure precedes the thing measured. And I mean, that's obviously true in quantum mechanics, right? Is mensuration that like defines the character of reality, and the probability spectrum is drawn around those acts of measurement. So measurement, limit, right? The term logos means limit, phrase, order, but that measure and ratio, I think, is important. And if you put the unlimited and indefinite ahead of limit and order, you're inverting that. And that's the same as putting the feminine principle above the masculine principle in theological terms. There's a reason why conventional, theology in the West has said that God is a man, in a sense, or he's male. And yeah, I mean, you'll encounter this with J. Dyer. God will not be a pure unity, but he won't be a pure multiplicity. He will contain somehow both, but there will be a preeminence of the one. And why does he say that? Because he's Orthodox Christian, and Orthodox Christians stole their theology from the Neoplatonists. And I think the history is really obvious if you look into it. Geographical proximity, the particular phrases that are used in Pseudo-Dionysius.
You're right.
Yeah.
But so is Jay.
So, yeah, but that there's a preeminence of the one over the many in the one itself, and before the indefinite, before the principle of the unlimited, there is the principle of limit, and it seems as though that is being inverted in the way that you're characterizing.
Okay, first of all, you're right. Neoplatonists were called heretics, and the church fathers and all that rejected them. So I did do a little bit of a deep dive into scholasticism, so that particularity I can talk on and not mix it up. That's embarrassing. Pythagoras comes before Parmenides. But Hegel says the same as you. He says, no, those guys were the ones that made the progress. And the way history recorded it is backwards. The scholastics were actually 1,000 years of stagnation in terms of genuine spiritual philosophy. The real progression came with, Jesus, and then, the early Christian movement, like in the first 200 years, I guess, was more about the way. Like they grasped the super-essentialist logic. They weren't stuck in the particularity and sinitized or made it sinful the teachings, because they weren't written down as rigidly as Rome eventually made them in the King James Bible, the Council of Nicaea and all that. But the stage that came as progressive after this, and kind of at the same time, were the Neoplatonists. And Hegel says Proclus, Plotinus, Iamblichus, those guys actually did advance real spiritual philosophy. But when Rome came in, they actually, and even Anselm was sort of like the beginning of the stagnation. He grasped the kind of infinite in a way, but he grasped the sensuous infinite in a way. And that's why he didn't make any real progress, even though he does have speculative thoughts. They're a repeat of what came before him. So you're absolutely right. The Aristotelian stuff that was preserved, that was good about the church, was shunned and banished, even though they were kind of using it in their external form. So that's why you're right. But Jay is also right, because the preeminence links back before the Neoplatonists to Jesus, to the Stoics, to Aristotle, to Plato, to Socrates, to Leucippus, to Parmenides, Zeno, Parmenides, and then Thales and whatever, right? Like it goes all the way back, even to the Upanishads. Like I really like that you can go in even prior, because Hegel does make a comment and he says these guys are worth mentioning even before formal philosophy begins, because they have the principles but not in scientific form. They have it in artistic, semi-religious form, almost theology. So he says they are foundational. Like it comes out of that. And I would say,
Written as dialogues, same as Plato.
what's that?
I mean, the Upanishads are dialogues.
Yeah,
So
they're
Plato
the
used
scientific
same-
version. Go ahead.
Yeah, Plato used the same literary convention as the authors of the Upanishads. Very likely was familiar with their philosophy.
Yeah, the Upanishads, yeah, and it's not because they're wrong, it's the form of expression. That's why this implicit, explicit thing I'm trying to say is really crucial at this. Like, you're ready for the next stage, man. And I would say, one, I think how we can have a sublation on this is by grasping the dialectic of limit itself. So that I'm really glad you clarified that, because the Neoplatonists were grasping it more correctly. Like, they came after. And I have to reread them because the first time I read them, I didn't quite get it. Like, it happens in stages. Like, you have to keep going the same thing over and over again. But at this point, what I can say is the dialectic of limit makes sense as reversed from what you said. Limit does not come first, and limitless comes after. The reason why it has to be inverted is because the limits, like all the if it's a true universal, it's always present, but it's not present explicitly. So the reason why this distinction between implicitude and explicitude becomes essential is because it resolves that deeper contradiction between why something can always be universal and present but not be expressed. So the limit is present in all the prior stages to limit, except that it's implicitly present. And that makes all the difference, because the absolute is always there. The first category, that's a no category, pure being, has a limit, but it's an implicit limit that it only makes real through its internal movement with pure nothing. But even though it's moving over a limit, it's still an implicit limit. It's a limit that's no limit. Anything that is implicit at first has that contradictionist to it. Contradictoriness to it. I have to make up words to describe what I'm saying because it's beyond ordinary thought. Contradistinction. If you make the limit explicit at that first stage, the other stages that come after don't make any sense, because there's other contradictions that start to happen and you can't resolve those. But like, even with that first category, like this guy named Jim Bob on another channel I went to, he's so close. He says, well, you can't have a presuppositionless beginning. And I said, you're technically right. So he says, well, how do you resolve this? There's no presupposition, but there is a presupposition with pure being. And I said, because the apophatic moment is a presupposition, number one, but it's a presupposition that is no presupposition. You have to have both. And he says, well, how does that make sense? And it's because the only way to get to pure being is by canceling all presupposition. That's the only presupposition you have to make. It's a self-refuting presupposition. All the other categories that are universal have that nature to it, including the limit. So the limit that is no limit is because it's implicit between pure nothing and pure being. If you really think about it, if you're not connecting anything to indeterminacy, you're still not creating an explicit limit. But there is a distinction. And a distinction is if you think about it, it's a lower form or a more abstract form of what? Of limit. But limit as limit only happens formally once it develops its own distinction. So the first limit that is a limit that's no limit is a distinction that's no distinction, and then it turns into a pure becoming between two moments. And these moments aren't between somethings, because something has to develop. It's between two things that have an implicit limit that are the exact same but different. Pure being and pure nothing are switching into each other. The only thing that happens in the second stage is it's not adding anything new. It's not adding an external being in, which would then create an external limit, a real limit. The limit is still internal or implicit because the moments are flipping between these things that are speculative unities. But the thing that's introduced from the stage of pure being and pure nothing to pure becoming is just the direction. The direction opposes itself. So the direction is the thing that's added, but it's not something external. It's just realization of what is already there. So that first moment of realization is the conversion of the implicit to the explicit. That's what becoming is, if you think about it. It's pure transition. But then what happens is pure becoming has to become itself. So then you get the first stable being that a real limit can start to build off of, like a stable limit that's actually there and isn't just pure vanishing. And infinitesimal in mathematics, and the reason why Hegel praises it, is because it is the first speculative grasping of that pure becoming in math. But math comes way later. There's no numbers here. That's why one doesn't belong yet, because you have to have a limit in itself, which is what the one is, which is why the many come after it. That's why you're correct to say that the one comes before the many, but the one in itself is not a concrete one. It's the conceptual one. And what builds itself into the conceptual one, the one of all, is the being for self of the self-transcending limit of finitude and the bad infinite. There's two infinites. And to get to the one, you have to overcome the wrong way of thinking of infinity, which is what I think you're mistaking Hegel is doing. You're saying he's doing the wrong infinite, but he's not. I think he's actually transcending the abstract notion of infinitude. He's saying there's the bad infinite, which opposes the finitude. And if you hold God there, you're wrong. He says, I'm not doing that. He says, I'm actually doing the genuine infinity, which is the infinity that is free from that abstract infinity of the finitude and the infinitude, the abstract infinite. And he says, when you grasp that negation of negation, he says that's genuine, that's the beginning, not yet genuine freedom, it's the principle of genuine freedom that results in the one. Okay, but limit comes before that. It's still, by this point, by the time the one is formed, limit is explicit, it's formal. But before limit, you have these implicit limits of distinction, then the changing of pure becoming as the limit between two moments, but of course moments aren't stable. You then get the becoming of becoming, which creates a determinate being. And determinate being has a determinateness, which is the beginning of a stable limit. It's like a half-stable limit, because it connects you. It's the starting of a connection to a return to yourself. It's the starting of an opposition of an other that is not you. It is not you. You are still returning to a pure nothing that immediately returns you back to a being, because a sublation is just a tracking back of a non-being to a being. That's why Christianity is right in saying sin and all this stuff is falsity. Once you sublate that partial limit of determinateness, the determinateness of determinateness, now you're starting to get a compounding of the structuring of a limit. You get not a limit yet, though. You get a something, but not a something of something. It's just pure something, just like a pure one. But it's not concrete enough to be a pure one, because there's not enough explicit expression to be a pure one. The determinateness of a determinateness leads to a particularization, the first particularization of a universal generalization. Now, I might be getting a little bit too weird. I don't know how much you're getting of this yet, but I'm just going to say, once you get to a pure something, then that particularizes itself into a something other, and then you start to get the real limit coming in. Then you get a transcendence of two types of moments. You get the moment of becoming and the moment of immediate being. So the moment of immediate being is the sheer something and the other immediately there. And then the sublation of that is an internal movement of the momentariness of those two as an alteration of the one something. So you get the one starting to build two, but it's going inwards to itself. Then once you get a determination in a something, it negates itself immediately into a constitution. And then that limit right there, that now you can start seeing between determination and constitution, now you can start seeing what we traditionally define as an explicit limit. But then that has to go one step further, and then you start getting to actual limit infinitude. And the holding of that explicit limit is what finitude is, which is why it looks like it ends. Hegel says it's like the saddest moment in logic, but it's not a true end. It's just the end of that limit. And then that limit repeats, and then you get to the one. That's pretty much the first couple of chapters of the science of logic. But what I'm just trying to make sense here is this implicitness and this explicitness is why limit has to come after unlimitedness, because indeterminacy has to truly be infinite in the indeterminate kind of way. It's an infinite that can't be said, so infinite. It can't be compared to anything else. If you have a mountain, like if you have a really high mountain, it's super high, and then you have another higher mountain, it's still conditioning. So there's no higher mountain than this indeterminacy. It's the highest mountain because there's no other mountains to compare it to. That's the only way to start that way. There can't be a real limit there. It has to be an implicit limit. But that doesn't mean, that's how you get over the contradiction. But it sounds like sophism, but it's the only way to do it, man. I can't think of any other way to to do it, because you're still, think about it, you're still not saying anything internal to indeterminacy. You're not saying what's in it, because it's moving its whole self. It's always moving in wholes. You're not saying anything in that first indeterminacy because it's truly ineffable. But you can speak about the holiness of it, which is eventually where the limit comes in. So in terms of what I just said, to me that makes like total sense now. Whereas like it took me like 3,600 hours to get that. But in terms of what I just said, where are you from a 0 to a 100% understanding?
I still think it is self-contradictory to talk about any of those prior levels without admitting that the principle of limit precedes them. You can call it implicit limit, whatever. I mean, Peros, the monad, is not a particular limit, and so in that sense, it's not explicit. I mean, explicit just means something that's said effectively. It's not, delineated and expressed outside of itself. The principle would not be something that's projected. So.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean
the principle of limit would not be some limiting activity.
Right.
Right? Like here, essence precedes energy. A thing's identity precedes what it does.
Yes.
These are different things. And the principle of limit precedes any limiting act.
Yeah, exactly.
Not a particular. Right. So.
But doesn't that mean?
Limit,
hold on, let me just stop you. Doesn't that mean that you can't have limit before limit? Like what you just said, the X can't do it until it comes. Like, am I understanding you right?
Well, all of this is prior to time, so act would be analogical, but there's no application of a limiting energy takes place to form the principle of limit. Couldn't, obviously.
So you're saying the limit can't be ahead of limit is what you're saying there, right?
I'm saying the arche, or principle of limit, Peros, or the monad, is the very first thing that can be conceptualized after the undifferentiated, the one, Brahman, right? The very first thing is the principle of limit, which is not a particular limiting act, isn't a particular limited thing, is the source of limitation. And that has to be first.
Yes, that's pure being. Think about it. It's unlimited. It's not limiting anything. It's the principle because it comes first. And it's also what Hegel calls Brahman. He says you're right. He also says that in Hinduism, that's Brahman. But he says the mistake that Hinduism is making is that this beginning is not a one that is separate from all the other manifestations of polytheism. He says all the other gods are treated as external to Brahman, right? Vishnu and Ram and all them. He says there's three first gods. Like, do you know what they are? There's Brahman, and then what's Vishnu?
Vishnu,
Shiva.
The Trinity.
Exactly. So he says that's actually, those three are sensuous figures for pure being, pure nothing, and pure becoming. Shiva is the pure nothing. Brahman is the pure being. And pure becoming is the third one, I guess. What's the third one?
Vishnu.
Vishnu? I guess Vishnu would probably be the pure becoming moment. But he says you're right. He says, yes, Brahman is that indeterminacy. It's the first principle. So you're right. Whatever you're thinking of right now, in terms of your mind, matching up, makes sense.
Indeterminacy is wrong. It's not a negation of determination.
You're kind of right. So now you're getting to another level of contradiction. He says in the very first chapters of, right after he does Pure Nothing, has like 4 remarks, and one of them is exactly about what you're saying. He says, as soon as you say that it's indeterminate, well, in order to say it's determinate, you have to have a determinacy to make that comparison. But he says it's so indeterminate at that stage that you can't even say that it's indeterminate. He says you can only call it indeterminate after the fact that it develops from the one, you can't call it a one, just say it's the principle. The principle is not separate from all the other determinations that are in it. They are forms of that same indeterminacy. So they're all indeterminacies that are determinate. That's how you get over that contradiction. And also, Heidegger's the one in many. How do you go from like a one being to a many beings and have one being? That's how he does it. That's how Hegel does it. Because it's all a form of that first indeterminacy. It determines itself. In itself.
So, yeah, I still have a problem here with the language being used at a symbolic level, at a mythological level. I don't think it's appropriate to place infinity above the principle of limit. And the reason is, like, metaphysically, I agree with invite to
Where do they say they're equal to? Because this is interesting to me as I'm getting deeper into it. But
the idea that Brahman, that Atman is Brahman, right? That the soul in us, the core, like not the soul as a whole, right? But the kernel of the soul, hyparxis of the soul in the Greek terminology, the summit of it is Brahman. That would be true of all the gods as well, right? The summit of all particular beings is this one, Platonic one, or Hindu Brahman, and that's the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, and that's the first place this philosophy appears in the world explicitly. I do think that Plato tended towards that, and if that's the view, then that's ontological monism, right? That there isn't a plurality of beings, that there is no discrete absolute separation among things. All things converge at their summits in this one real being.
Mm-hmm.
You could call it being, call it beyond being, whatever. It's not a particular being at that level. It is, you could say, universal.
The universal being, yeah.
You could say it's the goodness beyond being. And I think being, the Greek term ousia implies, in a certain sense, definition, right? It's beyond definition, so that's why it's beyond being. It's beyond ousia-ness. The English word being, maybe we can stretch a little bit further and use it there. But the only way to make sense of that, of the apparent multiplicity, is to say just that multiplicity differentiation is fundamentally apparent and not absolute. There is no absolute differentiation, which means there's only virtual differentiation. And so it is, as the tantric philosophy has it, Maya, or Prakriti, is projected by Purusha, the eternal man, which is like the essence in the essence energy distinction, and that's the limiting principle. That is what measures, and that's why in Masonry, the ruler and compass is used by the demiurge to construct the world, and that's why the demiurge uses similar tools in Plato. I think you have to put measure first before what is unmeasured. Any distinction starts from that virtual distinction that is projected from some source, and the source of the projection is prior to the thing projected, and that's the masculine, the divine masculine, projecting the divine feminine, and that's consistent through so many mythological traditions. It's consistent, like I said, there are echoes of this in mathematics. If you read Proclus on Euclid's Elements, you can see the symbolism is strong. Read Nicomachus of Peraza, or any of the Neo-Pythagoreans. Read Iamblichus on mathematics. There's a systematic reason why you have to privilege the source of limitation over the source of unlimitation. You privilege the source of energy above the source, you privilege the source of essence above the source of energy, and even just seeming to invert that is going to have, I think, dire mythological consequences that should be avoided, and that's what I don't like primarily in Hegel, is he appears to invert that.
So this is where it's going to get interesting. I think this is where I think a sublation might come to you, because you can never convince somebody from the external. But the one thing, so I think you have the order of the limit backwards, but the order of the measure you have right. So even in Hegel, like you just said, I think you just said something that maybe Hegel doesn't do this, but he does exactly what you just said. He says measure has to come before essence. That's why he ends the first, there's three moments of logic, right? Doctrine of being, doctrine of essence, and then doctrine of notion. So the reason why doctrine of essence comes after being is because being, as being, completes itself with its last moment as measure. It measures its own self, which converts it into essence. And then essence develops itself through its probably what you would call energy. This energy term, this energy essence distinction, I'm finding very interesting. I think it's
activity.
Yeah, I know, exactly. That's what it sounds like. It just sounds like there's the moment of immediacy, which is being, and then the moment of activity, which is negation, or the combination of the two is determinateness. But then essence, contradictorily, develops itself through energy. Its own energy, though. It's essential energy. So essential energy is how essence develops itself off the measure of being, completed being. And that's how you get the essential characteristics coming from an external that's still internal. And then eventually, once these two moments develop, like essence and being develop, they get sublated as a one, another one. Its essence and its being are in its own, they're both sublated in the notion, the true concept of the essence with its being. And so when you get that instantiation, a particularization of the essence and the being, at that level, that's when you start getting the development, the continuous remembering or continuous returning of the absolute idea to itself. And then you do get the one absolute idea, the one. And then you get an externalization of that as the created world, which then is another return on that return, a meta return, which is now the explicit knowledge. It has an implicit knowledge of itself. It's in itself. I think you said that earlier in this talk. That's why it's in itself. It's in and for itself, but it's an internal in and for itself. When you want a real an actual in and for itself, the inner and the outer have to become another unity, which is actual knowledge, explicit knowledge of that perfect internal for itself knowledge. That's what spirit is. That's the only reason why you need that second moment. In terms of the divine masculine and the divine feminine, these are sensuous terms that technically don't apply in the super-sensuous realm, right? Like even though the Garden of Eden and stuff like that has the Adam and Eve, that's because, at least Hegel says this, and I think he's right. The reason why that logic to the masculine and the feminine still apply in some sense in the sensuous world is because the first moment of the triad does differentiate itself into its second moment. So the Adam's rib turning into Eve, that's what they're trying to sensuously represent, is that dialectical movement. But the second movement completes the first one as a mirror. They become equals. And when they become equals, they don't become equals, I guess, in order, because the first moment is usually violent. That's why the dialectic is negative in the beginning. It's the abstract negation. But the concrete negation is what the divine feminine completes, so that they both rise into a higher unity, another first moment. So you say, well, then that's the masculine. That's why the father is a masculine. But the reason why the father is the masculine is only because it's in itself at the beginning. It's still just the first, even in the absolute idea form, it's still just the first moment of that spiritual knowledge. It's the perfect knowledge. That would be the father, the first moment still. And there's a second moment. And the created world would be the divine feminine, which is why nature is supposed to be feminine. But the reason why we transcend that distinction is because spirit is the sublation of those two as a repeating of the moment of essence and the moment of being in the sensuous world is completed. Then that third moment, the reason why it's neither male or female, it's both of them at the exact same time, is because even though it's a one absolute, it's a return to the Father. So you have that second moment and the first moment as one, which is why they both happen at the exact same time at the spiritual level. And I think it's just mind-blowingly consistent because the measure does come first, but measure should not be confused with limit. Even though, because remember, when you make limit comes before measure. It's like halfway between the first moment of being. These things that are happening with pure being, pure nothing, pure becoming, determinate being, quality, something, other, until you get to finitude and limit, these aren't measures explicitly. They are measures implicitly. And then after that, you get the limit turning into a measure of itself, which is why it becomes the first complete being that you can start building essence off of. If you don't have that order, you're going to be conflating those two. And there's going to be internal contradictions where you're not going to be able to resolve those any better. And I think the only way to really, we can keep getting into it, but if you're starting to feel a little bit, overwhelmed with the implicit and explicit distinction, it takes some time. And I would say if somebody else is watching this and you're getting it, one of the only other contemporary philosophers that I know that grasped they didn't grasp anything else, really, except for the whole and the part and the implicit and the explicit. The implicit and the explicit distinction is present in this guy named David Bohm. So if you go look up at his stuff, he doesn't get maybe any of the other moments about measure and limit, which you get. Like you get the measure one and the essence one. That's why essence has to come before energy. The implicit explicit one's really hard to get, but there's one guy that got it in the sensuous realm, and it's very interesting to me because I only got it because I understood the prior categories. I don't know how this guy did it without understanding the logical progression. So there's something really weird about David Bohm that's worth looking into if you want to understand implicitude and explicitude without having to understand this super essential kind of progression. So I'm not sure if I make sense. That's why I think the limit has to be this way, and you're right about the measure being first of essence.
I think measure entails the notion of limit.
That's why limit happens before it. It makes sense, right? Limit becomes formal before it. Remember, they're always measuring. They're universals. They're the all in all. They're always happening. But then, what makes the order in a timeless space is just the fact that they are switching positions of what's really there, present, explicit, for itself, and what is still implicit inside of itself. So Aristotle was trying to play with this distinction between potentialities and actualities, right? That's kind of what we're trying to do, except explicitude and implicitude is a little bit less developed than formal actuality and possibility. But in that universal realm, if you don't have that distinction of implicit and explicit, how do you resolve the contradiction between order and timelessness? You have to have that order, but if you do it from the intellect, you run into these contradictions where they're reversed and they result in more inconsistencies in the total system. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
the idea of the implicit being of a form preceding explicit being is there in the notion of causal containment. As I said, higher beings causally contain what you primarily exist at their own level. That's the authentic existence of a thing.
Yes.
Is where it is in its sense of an arche. So the authentic existence of limit will be the monad, which is the second member of the ontological hierarchy. That would be the authentic existence, but the limit is already causally contained in the one. So that sounds sort of similar to what you're saying with implicit and explicit. My problem here is like I said, mythologically, it is an inversion, and inversions in general of like standard mythological symbols, like the black mass and stuff like that, are harmful things spiritually. They are not beneficial. I don't like the emphasis on this succession of steps. It temporalizes. Obviously, it's analogical. The real thing is eternal. But I just don't see any improvement on Proclus here. And I think that a lot of this can sound very abstract. Obviously, it is. And it's not clear why you should prefer Neoplatonic language over Hegelian or vice versa. And I think you know a tree by its fruits, and you know the validity of the Pythagorean system because it has survived for millennia, and it informed actual mathematicians for millennia. I mean, Kepler was a Pythagorean. Newton was, believer in similar ideas. I don't know if you could call him a Pythagorean, but they definitely used Neo-Pythagorean ideas. Leibniz was a Neo-Platonist himself, and I just don't I don't see the reason why we should be privileging Hegelian language or showing where's the demonstration that it has this positive social utility, where something like Pythagoreanism just itself doesn't have utility. I think if you're measuring it by the results, Platonism is obviously has preeminence over Hegelianism, and so back to the project that you envision for changing the world, or I have similar ideas. Things are not headed in a positive direction in various senses, and I think having new educational institutions is important. And so I'm emphasizing Platonic education because it is foundational, and you literally can't understand the rest of Western philosophy unless you get that. And I basically, I don't really like what I've heard in that you are asserting the truth of this nomenclature for describing metaphysics without substantiating that. And it's the same problem that I have with Hegel, and one of the criticisms that Schopenhauer makes of Hegel is he uses this term spirit as if it's deeply significant, but doesn't really ground that concept in a robust way. Whereas even metaphysical concepts of Pythagoreans, you know the archetype of something by its instantiations, by the similarity that appears in its instantiations. So they're not vacuous concepts. Like the idea of limit is not a vacuous concept, it's very definite. Whereas spirit is kind of only intelligible in the relationship of Hegel's own concepts, his own kind of bespoke metaphysical categories. And that I just don't know. I think Hegel is a bit prideful in his writing. Not that Schopenhauer wasn't, but I don't think this new metaphysical system takes precedence over Plato. I think the problem is that people just don't understand plain old Platonism. Like most people who call themselves philosophers didn't get past step one, which should have been actually understanding the foundation of all this stuff on its own terms. And people aren't doing that. And so, yeah, I don't necessarily think Hegel is the solution for the problems in the world. I think Platonic education is more important than Hegelian education. I think trying to educate people, the masses, on Hegel is completely hopeless. I don't know if that's what you're intending to do, but I think a large number of people can be educated in Platonism, and that directly addresses the problems that we have morally, epistemologically, because most people today, like the average young person, is a nominalist. Like at some level, they kind of understand the idea of fixed categories, and there has to be something as such a thing as like the number two or whatever. But they, when pressed on it, they say math is like construction or whatever, and that has negative consequences. It is the deviation away from Platonism, Pythagoreanism, the deviation away from the traditional classical metaphysical systems that has caused a lot of problems in the modern day and led to this preeminence of indefiniteness and open, I can be anything I want to be. Like that is an expression of this aspect of the indefinite dyad, and we have privileged that. And I think Hegel is caught up in that same trend of privileging the infinite over the source of limitation. And so, yeah, I basically don't agree with the Hegelianism. I don't think it's been demonstrated to be beneficial for people, and philosophy should help people. Platonism has been demonstrated to be beneficial for people and for scientists. And so, how are you going to use Hegel to, heal the world, or whatever the plan is?
We're doing it right now. I mean, you're close, man. I have to say. Like, I'm trying to pick out places where you're negating, and I'm saying, well, how do I sublate that? Because in the living logic, like, you're creating oppositions, and you're at least giving some justifications, which allows the principles to be exposed and sublated. I'm trying to figure out, like, what I did answer all your questions in my interpretation. I just don't think you understood what I said. So how do I say it again? But this time, so you pointed out that Pythagorean, you're absolutely right, by the way. This is why it's hard to, like, when you're this close, it's hard to grasp why this is important, because you already almost have it. It's like these trivialities, like, oh, grounding and all this kind of stuff, oh, limit before and after, implicit, they seem like trivialities, but at this level of depth, they make all that, you end up in different worlds of meaning. Like, even just switching that order of limit, we're in different worlds now. That's why these incredible nuances, when they're universals, they apply to everything, right? So, like, if you have one wrong, the whole thing is like shaken, and you end up in this fragmentariness that Aristotle ended up in. But what I would say is, okay, you're right. One thing that you're right in what you just said for sure, and Hegel says this too, or even just, I can even stop using the word Hegel because the particularity of it starts to make it sound religious, so we'll just call it genuine philosophy. That's what Hegel was going for. And he didn't even really reach the full thing. He just reached the first completion of it. Is that the truth persists in contingent history. In real human-like years, like 2,000 years ago, and real, genuine advances of philosophy, of the truth, the true, do persist. They're not falsities. So the permanence in the impermanence persists. It is the substance of spirit over linear time. So you're right. That's why Pythagoras is still being used today. It's why Plato is. That's why Aristotle is. That's why the Neoplatonists are even making a little bit of a resurgence, I guess. And even Christianity has persisted. Is because they have to have universals in them. And you're right about that. So that's one thing that we have in common. Why has Pythagoras persisted, maybe even over Hegel? It's because he is useful. But I'm trying to point out a self-refuting contradiction in your statements, because that's the only way a logical person can get to it themselves. Like, you can only get the spirit yourself. I'm outside of you right now, so it's what I'm going to try and do is point out an internal contradiction to your positions, and I hope this is one of them. In the very beginning of this talk, you said that you don't like Hegel because he doesn't ground his system on anything stable or substantial. And in this talk, I showed he does. It's pure being, which is the same as Brahman and all these other places that, even the one, but not the one of necessarily what Pythagoras was talking about, because Pythagoras introduces way too much, but he was hitting on the right beginning. He was just calling it by a too concrete label. But 2,500 years ago, or whenever he existed, or he was 500 BC, I think, 507, 540. Which I know the dates, but the orders, of course, that comes after or before Parmenides. But for that period of time, like, it was incredible. He had that lucidity that he could even call it the one, But he needed to go further. But in terms of grasping it in a useful way, it's because numbers are a more concrete stage that's still abstract, pure enough to grasp the logic and use it in a sensuous form. But it itself is not grounded on the true substantial beginning, which is why he didn't complete the loop. He could talk about the loop, but he couldn't do it determinately. He couldn't explain it. Or do you think he actually explained the beginning of the one?
We don't know because we don't have Pythagorean documents.
Damn. Okay.
Neo-Pythagorean and basically myths about what Pythagoras thought. But so Plato is the first resource that actually gives like in-depth information about Pythagoreanism. And I do think that Plato was himself a Pythagorean. Hypothesis is strong. Multiple members of the founding members of the academy were Pythagoreans. I mean, there are stories about Plato buying books from Philolaus, who was a known Pythagorean.
Mm-hmm.
His friend. Anyway, there's historical evidence that Plato was, in a loose sense, a member of the school. Not from the beginning. We know some of Plato's teachers, but anyway, if the mature dialogues like the Parmenides are an indication of the Pythagorean system, then I think even with Pythagoras, this stuff had already been resolved, and I think actually this stuff had been resolved, these metaphysical issues, in the Upanishadic philosophy, and I think that disseminated to Greece. So I just don't agree that this stuff was like an incomplete, indefinite, inadequate state, and then was perfected much later in history. I think, and so there's a Platonic dialogue, the Ion, which talks about like how inspiration spreads from the muses, or I guess the gods above the muses to the playwright, and then to the director,
Mm-hmm.
and then to the actors, and finally down to the audience. And it's kind of like a magnet, right? You have a magnet and then a chain of iron objects that each successive member of the chain experiences that force a little bit weaker, but there's that one magnet that begins the chain. And I think that's the way that ideas actually do enter into history, not a gradual dialectic culminating in something, but it looks like this kind of perforation of the transcendent into time, and it starts in its like highest form in many cases. Egyptian culture seems to emerge in this way. The origin, the Neolithic, seems to operate this way. The history of Western philosophy operates this way, where successors to Plato are little read, forgotten, and not relevant. Plato is still relevant, and Aristotle is almost as relevant as Plato, but not quite. Plato is that magnet that we have in the tradition, and then everyone else depends on him. Like Alfred North Whitehead put it, like the history of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, and I think that makes sense with what I see, and I just don't agree with the criticism of ancient philosophy and saying Hegel. I don't see where Hegel improves. I don't see evidence that Hegel improves, except that maybe the ideas can have internal coherence. That's fine, but grounding your system on a set of ideas that themselves have internal coherence doesn't guarantee that it tracks reality. You need some grounding in reality, and epistemic, like plausible explanation for how we could access truth. And Hegel has the notion of spirit and all that, but Plato has the idea of the forms and our intuitions and nous and the different levels of our psyche in a very detailed way, and that it proved useful. Like he had the institution prior to the Library of Alexandria had the greatest number of mathematical discoveries. Like this epistemology, this way of thinking about things, developed science and mathematics. There's no Hegelian institutes that have come out with all of these new developments. It's not proving to be that powerful magnet.
That's a fantastic question. I don't know if you want to end here in 7 minutes at the top of, I think we're going for 2 hours, but this might be a good place
Yeah.
to actually leave it for another discussion. Because that's a great question, is the utility question. What I would say is Hegel does answer this, and I might even stop mentioning the word Hegel. I might just say genuine philosophy from now on, because I think the reason why we're negating is because of the particularities of the characters, Pythagoras and Plato, but their systems are really the concepts. And I can speak about this without mentioning Hegel ever, or Plato, or any of them, because the categories, the words themselves, if they're truly universal, apply to them all. And so what I would say is, like, I'm looking up Hegel's history of philosophy now, and he starts with the Ionic school, Thales, Anaximenes, and then Pythagoras, and then the Eleatic school. And he says and if you are in his history of philosophy in any way, except for a couple of philosophers, he says you are there because you have a real contribution to human knowledge that helps us live our lives, not just theoretically, but practically. And he has Pythagoras in there as the fourth philosopher because he did make a genuine contribution. That is, a genuine contribution means it can be used in practical spirit. It actually affects your being in this world, even though the concepts are super-essentialities in the super-essentialist world. What I would say happened with Hegel, if we want to be particular about human history and why it seems like he hasn't had this big blow up and changed the world. If he has an answer like Plato or Pythagoras did, it should be creating like resonant shockwaves, you know? And what I think happened was because Hegel was not born into aristocracy or anything like that, and it took him till he was 37 to actually write his first book. I think by the time the supersensuousness of the universals started coming through his being, through words and writings and his philosophies, he was rising to fame, but he died too soon. And what happened was he was writing this contradiction between the French Revolution, the introduction of abstract reason, which he was still for but against at the same time, which seems contradictory, but it's not. It just means the form of reason, the sublation to a higher form of reason in church and state is correct, but they had the wrong form of reason, but it was in the right spirit. So the concrete reason, which is what genuine philosophy is based on, is what the state should be based on as reason. If you have abstract reason, which the French Revolution was based on, even though it was a necessary step in history, it's what created the terror as a counterbalance, as the energy of that abstract essence. To use your language a little bit more Christian, I don't know what kind of language that is it like theological scholasticism? But in order, what's that?
Like essence, energy, those Platonic terms.
Okay, they're Platon. Okay, because there's so many. Like once this clip, go ahead.
Other schools, I mean, use the same concepts. They're basically just Greek metaphysical, ancient Greek metaphysical.
Okay, so the church still took it from Aristotle. Well, and Plato. Okay, that makes sense still. But because there's so many systems, like for me, it's like mind-bending how many different ways we can describe the same essence. That's the problem. That's the fundamental problem of why this new genuine philosophy, whether we call it Hegelian or not, we're going to transcend him. He's just a stepping stone, right? And he even says that. But he says you can't transcend somebody unless you understand the true limit of the universal of the principle of their philosophy. And he says he did that with all of them, including Plato and Pythagoras. So what I would say the usefulness is that if you have truth, we're all saying the exact same thing, because there's only one truth, right? We're all saying the exact same thing. The problem isn't the thing. The problem is the expression of the thing to ourselves, that we can't agree on the expressions, which is why we grasp two different concepts of the same thing, and we war in that falsity. That's the fundamental problem. And in order to solve that problem, you have to create expressions that are logically uniting with people who are rational beings, because what is real is rational, what is rational is real. The good is rational, and the rational is good. If you grasp real rationality, not the abstract kind, you don't get this terror, this energy that gets an abstract negation, which causes the the limitation, the evil, or the one-sidedness. When you have concrete thinking, when you think in the true living spirit of that way of speculative logic, that's the real philosophical thinking that prevents the essence from turning into an abstract negation and staying there. Because you have to have the abstract negation, you have to have the energy, but the energy of the energy is the real living spirit. And I would say the usefulness of Hegel to get us as a stepping stone to the next level of genuine philosophy, which you for sure, man, are gonna you'll be teaching me this once you get the chain, is that it gives you a way to describe that magnet chain. And if you have no way to describe the linkages with concrete language, it has to remain ineffable in some sense or confused. And that is where that sinfulness comes in, the disconnect comes in that prevents a unifying of spirit. The trickiness of this is you can, once you grasp the universal, you can rebuild it from any point in history. Like we can use all Platonic terms from now on. Like if I really wanted to, we could just, as I'm learning more about the Platonic language, we could just rebuild it. And any words that he was missing that came in Neoplatonists or whatever, Apocalypse or whatever, we could just make them up in his language as a neologism or something. Same can happen with Pythagoras. The same can happen with the Upanishads. They all had the essence. If they were enlightened, like Buddha, if they were really enlightened, they did grasp the circle. The problem was communicating that. And the followers, because they're the actors, I like that drama thing like that, director, like I really like how you use that. The actors are the ones that sinitize it, like make it sinful in Christian language, or make it, what's the word that Plato would use? You're in ignorance of the truth of it. So you operate from that ignorance, and you create beings that are false in this world. So we call it sin in Christianity, but what do you call it in Platonic lingo? You would call it just falsity?
Vice.
Vice? Instead of virtue. Yeah, virtue is based on, okay, that makes sense. So I would say if you're really stuck on the Pythagorean and the Platonic representations, we can stick with that particularity because the universals are the same. But if you want to describe that chain, I think you have to do it in a concrete logic, which they all kind of grasped, but it was like even the reason why, and I'll end on this maybe, the reason why Plato is an essential moment in pointing out the chain is that he had the first magnet and then a couple of linkages explicit. The rest of them were there, but they were implicit even to Plato because he didn't grasp the system fully as a circle determinate on itself. So that's why he has to be an essential moment. That's why everything else is a footnote after him, because they're just building off the chain. And that's what Hegel says too. He says the only reason why I'm here saying what genuine philosophy is because I grasped the chain of what each one of these people played. And there's people in history that didn't get fair coverage, like Jakob Boehm. And he made an essential contribution, but he's missed in history. And the reason why Hegel is not having his moment yet is because he upset the king. He was rising to prominence because spirit was coming through him on the foundation of Pythagoras and Plato, which he fully gives credit for. But what happened is, as he was rising up, he became as famous, or in some cases more famous than the king, King Ferdinand. And Ferdinand started getting jealous because people started celebrating Hegel's birthday more than the king's and other things like this. And so when Hegel died young, 61, the king hired all his contemporary nemesis, his negations like Schelling and Schopenhauer and these guys, to stop the dragon seed of philosophy. So this big negation happened. And that's why for the last 200 years we've been experiencing the negative moment of his truth as an actualization of the principle of it. And the usefulness of it is still coming because it's putting into context the truth of what Pythagoras and Plato and everybody else before him, including the Neoplatonists, had done in that full chain. But it's hard to grasp the full chain. So maybe next time we can get into it more, but I hope I answered a few of the questions. And if you have any more questions, if I didn't explicate the answers, then maybe we can really get into the nitty-gritty in a written form where we can kind of like point it out more concretely. Thanks for letting me talk for so long.
Yeah, no problem. So, I wanted to hear your perspective. You have an interesting screen name and an interesting mission, and I agree with, I think, what you're trying to do in a certain respect, but I think, you put a lot of trust in Hegel, in particular, and his neologisms. I'm not averse to neologisms. Like, I appreciate Chris Langan's work. And
No, Hegel doesn't use neologisms. We're just saying if we have to go to prior systems, we might have to.
Well, he does. He changes the meaning of some terms, so maybe that's not a neologism. But in any case, we can use new terms, old terms. I guess either way. But I think there is a utilitarian argument to be made for the Platonic language because it has that historical weight, because it's already known, because it is informed our lexicon, it's shaped our language, and so like it's just like you can use any word to mean anything you want, but if you deviate from the grounded etymological roots, then it becomes more difficult to communicate. I think Hegel makes it more difficult to communicate about some of these concepts than just the Platonic language, which is kind of inherently more universal and familiar to people because it has that historical weight. I don't really know what in particular Hegel does that other philosophers have not done still at this point. It seems like I don't think anyone should be so confident in the one thinker that they are the cheerleader for that they dismiss what previous philosophers or other philosophers have done. I think a little bit more humility or like acknowledgement of ignorance would be beneficial rather than like charging forward and championing this one figure when is he actually the solution to our problems? Is this the philosophy we have to ground ourselves on? Do we actually understand what Plato himself said? I think in the vast majority of cases, people have not moved beyond step one in learning the history of Western philosophy, and so that's kind of where I stand. And I don't know that you'll meet with the success being a champion of Hegel, but you obviously have the spirit to want to help and to want to find the truth, and that's fine. But I don't know. I think you might be getting a little carried away and trusting Hegel too much, and that's my take as far as I can see it. But I don't dislike you. It's an interesting conversation, and I hope we do speak again.
Okay, and if there is anybody else that listens to what I said and it makes sense to you, reach out to me if you can. I do have my own YouTube channel, I guess, and Spiritman's my screen name on Twitch. And what's the best way to reach me? There's something called Spirit of Wewa, WEWA @gmail.com. And it's hard, right, to grasp it at first, because if it was easy, we would all grasp it. But I think for you, Eric, man, you're going to get it. Like, I can already see you getting it. So I think what I'll do for next time is I will stay within your domains of familiarity, because you're right. Plato, for philosophers, Plato and Aristotle are more familiar, more universal. But for the average person, totally not. If you use Platonic terms for the average person, they don't care at all. So really, we have to move in people's domains of familiarity. And I really am glad you picked Pythagoras and Plato, because those are pretty easy to start with. And they are foundational. So we can start the foundation. And I think with your help, you can help me find a way to explicate this that makes sense to this community. So if would you help me actually learn the language more precisely, like energy, essence, and I've been meaning to reread the Timaeus, but like I feel like you're somebody that can teach me the right way to do this, and then when you grasp it, you will probably be the real, like one of the real teachers. You can do it from anywhere. Like I really sense that you and Jay Dyer are really close. Like really, out of the people I've talked to so far, you have the foundation there. I'm just not connecting to the language properly. So if you want to help me in some way and you think there's something I should do, I will be very open to you. And maybe next time we do talk, I can speak on your terms.
Maybe, yeah, I do teach, run reading groups, book clubs on Plato, Neoplatonists. We're doing Aristotle's working on, and then some other physics stuff. So you can join those groups if you like. Usually people will sign up on Patreon. My link for that in the description, and I'll put Spiritman's links in the description as well. If you could just after we hang up, go ahead and message me the whole relevant links you want there. But yeah, there aren't enough interesting philosophical characters around, especially ones that are passionate about what they're talking about. Again, I don't think it's good to assume that you found it when do you really know the history well enough to conclude that? Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thanks everybody for listening. Take care. All right. So why Spiritman? Just because Hegel used the concept spirit, and that's...
Yeah, in the beginning it was just spirit, and then I was in this Hegel group, and because the chapter was about spirit, I was like, well, spirit makes this comment, and they're thinking, well, was that the text that said spirit, or was it the spirit guy, spirit? And I said, can you change your name to something that particularizes the name?
Oh,
So
I'm sorry, I closed OBS, and that shut out my audio. My bad. What's that?
okay.
I always do that. I'm trying to clean up my desktop, and then... Okay. Go ahead.
What part did I cut out at? Oh yeah, the Hegel group thing. So yeah, they said, can you particularize your name so we can distinguish between the two comments or something? And I said, okay, what should I put? And so it was just like, well, you're a man. And so I said, okay, let's just put them together, Spiritman. And then I realized, oh, that's kind of like a, it didn't hit me at first, but it's got an interesting ring to it. But at first, it was more like a joke, and it's sort of grown. It's a memorable name that I think does convey the universal and the particular. So I thought, well, I'll stick with it and see how people react. And the reaction's pretty interesting so far. So I'm gonna keep it, and in the future, I think once I figure out my approach, I might even just change the name to whatever somebody wants it to be, because people negate you when you're not starting internally. So that's why if there's a Platonic name, maybe the idea, I don't know, just something that fits into the nomenclature of the people I'm talking to. But for the universal, Spirit's supposed to be the universal of universals, right? So that's why if I have to do a generic thing, I'll probably stick with that. And then if I make a lot of mistakes along the way, like even now showing my face, I'm like, shoot, I don't have the presentation yet. Like when you have the presentation mode, you talk speculatively, and I'm not quite there, but I'm getting closer. And I think in a couple of months I'll probably be there. But you're one of the people that has like enough space, like enough compassion, enough love in your heart to create enough of a space where I can make those mistakes and then still be able, like, be forgiven later to grow out of the abstractions. So that's why I'm taking the risk with you. But in the future, maybe I won't even have my real identity necessarily. So I'm allowed to make those mistakes. But we live in an abstract culture which doesn't let you grow, which is why it's dangerous. Like you're, to me, pretty courageous in making your channel. Because even if you do decide to change, people will see these old videos and hold you to your old self. And that's why we're not in a living
Yeah, people
spirit.
do that.
Hmm?
People do actually do that. But yeah, I admire what you're doing as well. Glad you're doing it. So if you want to set up a conversation in the future, or if you actually do want to join the reading groups, just message me. I'll send you relevant links. And yeah, good talking with you, Mark.
Okay, pleasure, my friend. I might send you an email to shorten it a little bit, but yeah, I really enjoyed meeting you.
Okay, take care.
Peace. Oh, still recording. For the Spec Team, if you're watching this one, what I think will create the sublation, like in terms of scores, the sublation on this one I would think is, like we got to a real particular dialectic, like limit and measure. Like we got specific. So I think for him, like we probably had like 12, probably 12-ish, 20-ish agreements. No, probably not 20, but 10 to 12 maybe, intuitively. But the big difference is the limit thing. And he could actually explicate it. So that's how deep his knowledge was. So I think that once he understands how to reverse the explicit and implicitness of limit, because limit has to justify itself through its principles. But how do you have principles that are less than limit that rebuild it? He actually agreed with me twice, or he actually noticed the contradiction in his position. So I could have stayed on that a little bit more. Maybe that's where the sublation was. But it sounded like he wanted to move on a little bit. But I did get to say my points, that the explication is the problem, right? It's getting it into a form, because they're all saying it in a right way, but it's just sometimes in the wrong order because they're not explaining it the right way, actually. So I guess maybe it isn't always the right way, like the limit. I think once he grasps it the right way, then he'll have a big realization, and then we'll continue talking. But there's 117 people, 117 different philosophy systems that this has to happen. But I'm hoping the people that watch it can see that that was probably an implicit sublation of, man, that's pretty close. It's almost like one thing, almost. 80%, that was probably an 80% sublation, and a probably, like he caught himself in contradictions twice, I could see it. So that's got to be at least an explicit sublation of, I don't think it was over half, maybe 49%, 46%, we'll say. So 46%, no. Okay, you're still disagreeing with me a lot, yeah, but he's changing his position. Yeah, I wouldn't put it over half, but explicitly, it was a soft negation in terms of tone. Somewhere between 30 and 46% sublation, I would say. Yeah, okay, let's just say that. 80% internal, 30% external. Yeah, 30 sounds better. Okay, so maybe I'll upload my version, or he'll upload his version. We will see. But one more, and we'll see what happens. Maybe I can do Jay Dyer next. That'd be really interesting.